Okay, good morning everybody. I'm continuing with the Seven Factors Awakening readings. I'll be doing 3, and I thought I would kind of go between reading some Dhamma talks from Ajahn Jeff. They're from a collection that we have called e-published Dhamma talks. Volume 3 is the one that I'll be reading a few from. I believe there is like evening puja talks that he gives, kind of short Dhamma talks during meditation. And then I'll also be doing some sutta readings. Today I'll be reading a few suttas from the Anguttara Nikaya. And so they're not, these selections that I've chosen aren't specifically on the Seven Factors of Awakening, but they deal with the particular qualities among the list in the way that they relate to practice. So the ones that I'll be doing today are kind of related to samadhi practice and Dhamma-vichaya, mindfulness, investigation of qualities. So first one I'd like to do is Ajahn Jeff Dhamma talk. I'll read. It was given in 2006, and short talk. It's called Doing, Maintaining, Using, and it's about samadhi practice. He uses the word concentration. I'll just go with that, but he's referring to samma samadhi, one of the awakening factors. Ajahn Fuang once said that there are 3 stages to concentration practice. The first is learning how to do it, the second is learning how to maintain it, and the third is learning how to put it into use. The doing is not all that hard. Focus the mind on the breath. The breath is right there. You don't have to go scrounging around. You don't have to go to the ends of the earth to find your breath. It's right next to the mind. It's simply a question of learning to be more sensitive to it. That's the hard part of doing it, having a clear sense of when the breath is coming in, when it's going out. Having a clear sense of when you are making it unnecessarily uncomfortable. This involves watching it for a while and then adjusting it. Think a little bit longer. Think a little bit shorter. See how the breathing responds and how it feels as it responds. You can think deeper. Think of your whole body all the way down to your toes, breathing in, breathing out. Think of the breath all around the body. Think of the body as being like a big sponge and the breath is coming in through all the pores. See what way of conceiving the breath feels best. Once you learn how to do this, then the trick is learning how to maintain it. In other words, learning how not to slip off. Learning how to make it comfortable is one of the tricks in learning how to maintain it, because the mind is always looking for food. What we're doing as we're meditating is giving it good food to eat. The sense of comfort that comes with being familiar with the breath helps get the mind more and more inclined to keep coming back. It's like feeding a stray dog. If you give it good food, it's going to come back. The mind has a tendency to stray, but as long as you feed it well, it'll learn more and more that this is a good place to be. A really good place to be. A really good place to feed. You can think of the meditation techniques as cooking techniques. You're learning how to feed yourself well. Most of us are the kind of person who just goes rummaging through a garbage heap, then eats whatever, anything that even remotely resembles food. And of course you get sick that way. Sometimes you get good food, sometimes you get bad. You hear stories about restaurants throwing out good food, so sometimes you get good food as you rummage around. But a lot of times it's garbage. really bad garbage. Sometimes it's spoiled. But you keep on eating it because you don't have better food. You don't know how to cook. There was a homeless shelter in DC years back. They went around to all the embassies and all the really good restaurants in DC and just asked for their leftover food. Then they took that and served it at the homeless shelters. All of a sudden, the homeless people were eating French food and other exotic dishes. This got the homeless people interested in this kind of food. So right next to the soup kitchen, they offered to teach the homeless people how to cook French food and other exotic dishes. As a result, many of the homeless people became really good chefs. They were able to get jobs. This is a good metaphor for our meditation. We learn how to eat well, how to feed the mind well, so we don't have to go running through garbage bins. As the mind learns to feed well, it'll have a tendency not to want to go back to its old ways. This leads naturally to that third step, using the meditation. The mind needs strength in all kinds of situations, and not only while you're sitting here with your eyes closed. In fact, it especially needs strength when you're dealing with difficult people, difficult situations that give rise to anger, situations that give rise to fear. One of the important uses of concentration is to learn how to keep the mind with the breath in the midst of all kinds of strange situations, all kinds of challenging situations. Instead of leaping out, putting all your awareness outside, you try to keep your awareness centered inside as you deal with whatever's hard to deal with. That way you're coming from a position of strength. So you learn how to stay with the breath and keep the breath comfortable when there's fear, when there's anger, when there's greed, when there's uncertainty, when there are all kinds of things happening around you or happening inside the mind. This is where the concentration really shows its benefits, in that you can keep feeding and strengthening the mind, even in the midst of difficult situations. It's also by learning how to feed the mind in situations like this that you gain more and more insight into the mind. You begin to see how it slips off into its old habits, what tempts it to slip off. Sometimes it's fear. You're afraid if you let your old defenses down, this new defense is not going to help. But as you get more confident in your meditation, you begin to realize that this is a much better defense, coming from a position of strength. When the mind is calm and centered, you can think more clearly. Then you learn how to apply it. In situations where you would tend to get depressed, you can cheer up the mind simply by the way you relate to the breath, by the way you relate to your sense of the body. Other times, when the mind seems scattered all over the place, you can learn how to focus it and settle it down, and just keep it really, really solidly based. The Buddha talks about 3 important skills in learning how to keep the mind centered. One is gladdening the mind, another is steadying the mind, and the third is liberating the mind. Whenever you find that a particular feeling has taken over, just learn how to pry the mind loose from its grip, so that the mind is free even in the midst of situations that would normally tie it down or oppress it. So all of these are techniques in the proper care and feeding for the mind. As you feed the mind properly like this, it leads naturally into gaining insight into the various component factors of your meditation. You'll have learned that in this situation you have to add more pleasure, in that situation you have to change your perceptions, in this situation you have to change the way you think about these things. Well, these are all different aggregates, feelings, perception, thought constructs. As you learn how to use them in different ways to deal with different situations, they begin to stand out more clearly because you see them in action. You've used them in action. This is where you're going to gain real insight into them, how you can relate to them in a way that's healthy rather than just grabbing on and gobbling them down. This is how the mind begins to gain insight into its attachments. Because it sees the component factors, it's learned how to use them in a way that it's really on familiar terms with them, and it's changed its relationship to them. They now become tools rather than things that you would identify with or things that you were constantly chewing on, because you learned how to feed the mind better, feed it more skillfully. So wherever you are in the practice, if you find that you haven't been able to do the concentration, work on just bringing things together here. Once you've learned how to do it, then learn how to maintain it. And once you learn how to maintain it, the way to gain insight into it is not to try to take it apart yet. It's through learning to apply it to all kinds of different situations so that you get a really good feel for it. As you gain that feel for it, then the various elements of form, feeling, perception, thought constructs, and consciousness begin to separate out. You can watch them for what they are. Then when you let them go, it's not that you throw them away. You've simply learned that you don't have to identify with them. You can pick them up when you need them, put them down when you don't. So this is how the practice of concentration leads to discernment. It teaches you how to eat well, how to feed the mind well, to the point where ultimately it doesn't have to feed anymore. So next I'm going to read a sutta from Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Sevens, and I wanted to follow this talk with this sutta because it also has the same sort of theme of feeding the mind and meditation and right concentration being food for the mind and food for the practice. Hopefully it's a fair question, so cool.
I was curious about when Paul's with Thanissaro or anybody else who has words about it, when he talks about maintaining the breath and sort of getting to that state of being with it throughout daily activities, if there are activities that maybe if that's not the best thing to do, like the breath isn't the best object to stay with, if there are other objects that would work better so like if you're in a conversation or if you're doing something complicated, where if I start where to go, where to put the mind, if the breath feels hard to stay with throughout daily life.
That's some wisdom. You've got to learn how to use wisdom. That's the purpose. The whole goal of Buddhist practice is not to have your mind on the breath. The whole goal of the Buddhist practice is to not suffer. So you have to really learn how to apply wisdom. That's your refuge, more than a desperate attempt to hold on to the breath.
Any other comments or questions? Alright, so this is a sutta that I've always liked a lot. It's called the Simile of the Fortress, Anguttara Nikaya Sevens. So it talks about a king's frontier fortress that's on sort of the border of enemy territory or something like that, in a dangerous place. And the 7 sort of important things that the fortress is equipped with, as well as the 4 types of food and fuel, really, but the things that the people in the fortress are consuming to continue their life and their battle there. And then the Buddha makes a simile between that and 7 Dhamma qualities that are needed and and then the type of food that we need to continue and develop our practice. So I just thought it's quite nice. Picking up on the theme of Ajahn Jeff talking about feeding the mind with really good food. There's a couple words in here that I actually looked up. Right, I didn't know what they meant, but anyway, we'll get to that. One is appurtenance. I believe that's like a feature, characteristic feature in relation to the fortress. Appurtenance is a new word for me. Bhikkhus, when a king's frontier fortress is well provided with 7 appurtenances of a fortress, and readily gains without trouble or difficulty 4 kinds of food, it can be called a king's frontier fortress that cannot be assailed by external foes and enemies. What are the 7 kinds of appurtenances of a fortress with which it is well provided? Here, bhikkhus, in the king's frontier fortress, the pillar, which I guess is the main pillar of the building, the main structural pillar. The pillar has a deep base and is securely planted, immobile, unshakable. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with this first appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, the moat is dug deep and wide. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with the second appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, the patrol path is high and wide. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with this third appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, there many weapons are stored, both missiles and hand weapons. And there's a note, and what Bhikkhu Bodhi is translating as missiles has to do with like projectiles, arrows and spears and that sort of thing. Both missiles and hand weapons. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with this fourth appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, many kinds of troops reside. That is, elephant troops, cavalry, charioteers, archers, standard bearers, camp marshals, food servers, Uga caste warriors, frontline commanders, great bull warriors, attack soldiers, shield-bearing soldiers, domestic slave soldiers. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with this fifth appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, the gatekeeper is wise, competent, and intelligent, one who keeps out strangers and admits acquaintances. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with this sixth appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, the rampart is high and wide, covered over by a coat of plaster. A king's frontier fortress is well provided with the seventh appurtenance for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. It is well provided with these 7 kinds of appurtenances. And what are the 4 kinds of food that it readily gains without trouble or difficulty? Here, bhikkhus, in the king's frontier fortress, much grass, firewood, and water are stored up for the delight, relief, and ease of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, much rice and barley are stored up for the delight, relief, and ease of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, many foodstuffs, sesame, green gram, and beans are stored up for the delight, relief, and ease of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. Again, in the king's frontier fortress, many medicaments, ghee, butter, oil, honey, molasses, and salt are stored up for the delight, relief, and ease of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. These are the 4 foods that it readily gains without trouble or difficulty. So just a note here for the first one, I think it's pretty much referring to the fuel, that grass firewood and that sort of stuff, the fuel and the water that they would use to prepare food. When bhikkhus, a king's frontier fortress is well provided with these seven appurtenances of a fortress, and when it readily gains, without trouble or difficulty, these four kinds of food, it can be said that a king's frontier fortress cannot be assailed by external foes and enemies. So too, bhikkhus, when a noble disciple possesses 7 good qualities, and when he gains at will, without trouble or difficulty, the 4 jhanas that constitute the higher mind and are pleasant dwellings in this very life, he is then called a noble disciple who cannot be assailed by Mara, who cannot be assailed by the evil one. What are the 7 good qualities that he possesses? Just as, bhikkhus, the pillar in the king's frontier fortress has a deep base and is securely planted, immobile and unshakable, for the purpose of protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too the noble disciple is endowed with faith. He places faith in the enlightenment of the Tathagata thus: the Blessed One is an arahant, perfectly enlightened, accomplished in true knowledge and conduct, fortunate knower of the world, unsurpassed trainer of persons to be tamed, teacher of devas and humans, the enlightened one, the Blessed One. With faith as his pillar, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses this first good quality. Just as the moat in the king's frontier fortress is dug deep and wide for the purpose of protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too a noble disciple has a sense of moral shame. He is ashamed of bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct. He is ashamed of acquiring bad, unwholesome qualities. With a sense of moral shame as the moat, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses a second good quality. Just as the patrol path in the king's frontier fortress is high and wide for the purpose of protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too a noble disciple dreads wrongdoing. He dreads bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct. He dreads acquiring bad, unwholesome qualities. With moral dread as the patrol path, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses this third good quality. And just a note here, I believe that the second one would be hiri, and then the third one, what I just read, is otapa. So Bhikkhu Bodhi is translating those as moral shame and moral dread.
I have a question. Is that first, the pillar, is that Indriya?
What do you mean, Indriya?
It says the pillar is faith.
Yeah.
You know the Pali that he uses for pillar, is that Indriya or?
I don't know what the Pali would be in that case.
Okay.
That would probably be pillar. I mean, in the sense of whatever it is, probably the literal. Not a literal thing that went in.
There's often the word like inda kila. That's it's in a lot of it's in some of the chants, and it's like a pillar. It's like some sort of, but it has to do with Indra.
A pillar of Indra.
Yeah.
Indra.
Yeah.
Has that root, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be related to that, but you have to look at the Pali. So the fourth. Just as many weapons, both missiles and hand weapons, are stored in the king's frontier fortress for the purpose of protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too a noble disciple has learned much, remembers what he has learned, and accumulates what he has learned. Those teachings that are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and phrasing, which proclaim the perfectly complete and pure spiritual life. Such teachings as these he has learned much of, retained in mind, recited verbally, mentally investigated, and penetrated well by view. With learning as his weaponry, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses this fourth good quality. Just as many kinds of troops reside in the king's frontier fortress, that is, elephant troops, cavalry, charioteers, archers, standard bearers, camp marshals, food servers, Ulu caste warriors, frontline commandos, great bull warriors, attack soldiers, shield-bearing soldiers, and domestic slave soldiers, for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders. So too a noble disciple has aroused energy for abandoning unwholesome qualities and acquiring wholesome qualities. He is strong, firm in exertion, not casting off the duty of cultivating wholesome qualities. With energy as his troops, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses the fifth good quality. Just as the gatekeeper in the king's frontier fortress is wise, competent, and intelligent, one who keeps out strangers and admits acquaintances, for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too a noble disciple is mindful, possessing supreme mindfulness and alertness, one who remembers and recollects what was done and said long ago. With mindfulness as his gatekeeper, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses the sixth good quality. Just as the rampart in the king's frontier fortress is high and wide, covered over by a coat of plaster, for protecting its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too a noble disciple is wise. He possesses the wisdom that discerns arising and passing away, which is noble and penetrative and leads to the complete destruction of suffering. With wisdom as his coat of plaster, the noble disciple abandons the unwholesome and develops the wholesome, abandons what is blameworthy and develops what is blameless, and maintains himself in purity. He possesses the seventh good quality. And what are the four jhanas that constitute the higher mind and are pleasant dwellings in this very life, which he gains at will, without trouble or difficulty? Just as, bhikkhus, much grass, firewood, and water are stored up in the king's frontier fortress, for the delight, relief, and comfort of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too, secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a noble disciple enters and dwells in the first jhana, which consists of rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by thought and examination, for his own delight, relief, and comfort, and for entering upon nibbana. Just as much rice and barley are stored up in the king's frontier fortress for the delight, relief, and comfort of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too, with the subsiding of thought and examination, a noble disciple enters and dwells in the second jhana, which has internal placidity and unification of mind, and consists of rapture and pleasure born of concentration, without thought and examination, for his own delight, relief, and comfort, and for entering upon nibbana. Just as many foodstuffs, sesame, green gram, and beans are stored up in the king's frontier fortress for the delight, relief, and comfort of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too, with the fading away as well of rapture, a noble disciple dwells equanimous and, mindful and clearly comprehending, he experiences pleasure with the body. He enters and dwells in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare. He is equanimous, mindful, one who dwells happily. for his own delight, relief, and comfort, and for entering upon Nibbana. Just as many medicaments, ghee, butter, oil, honey, molasses, and salt, are stored up in the king's frontier fortress for the delight, relief, and comfort of its inhabitants and for warding off outsiders, so too with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous passing away of joy and dejection, a noble disciple enters and dwells in the fourth jhana, neither painful nor pleasant, which has purification of mindfulness by equanimity, for his own delight, relief, and comfort, and for entering upon Nibbana. These are the four jhanas that constitute the higher mind and are pleasant dwellings in this very life, which he gains at will without trouble or difficulty. When, bhikkhus, a noble disciple possesses these 7 good qualities, and when he gains at will without trouble or difficulty, these 4 jhanas that constitute the higher mind and are pleasant dwellings in this very life, he is then called a noble disciple who cannot be assailed by Mara, who cannot be assailed by the evil one. So, any comments or questions on that sutta?
John's food is interesting because, like, when you eat food, you're like, there's a time to stop as well. It's like, oh, I've had enough. It's time to put this down. Would leaving jhana be just as like a value skill, like letting go of that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because you can leave and leave yourself jangled, and you can come out of a settled state, and then come out kind of jangled, because of there's not a smooth transition, or one can be, say, come out of a settled state and then long for the settled state and be resentful of people. So there's different ways of, there's creating a smooth transition between the meditation and the becoming that leaving.
We have a few more minutes. There's another short sutta I thought I would read. A little shorter. It's quite dense. There's a lot of detail kind of packed in there, but it's a sutta showing the progression from mindfulness through 8 different qualities to the knowledge and vision of liberation, and kind of showing the conditionality of these different Dhamma qualities that we're practicing, and how one kind of relates to the next one, going higher and higher. And so the sutta is called Mindfulness. It's Sutta 81 in the Book of the Eights. Bhikkhus, when there is no mindfulness and clear comprehension, for one deficient in mindfulness and clear comprehension, the sense of moral shame and moral dread, hiriyottapa, lack their proximate cause. When there is no sense of moral shame and moral dread, for one deficient in a sense of moral shame and moral dread, restraint of the sense faculties lacks its proximate cause. When there is no restraint of the sense faculties, for one deficient in restraint of the sense faculties, Virtuous behavior lacks its proximate cause. When there is no virtuous behavior, for one deficient in virtuous behavior, right concentration lacks its proximate cause. When there is no right concentration, for one deficient in right concentration, the knowledge and vision of things as they really are lacks its proximate cause. When there is no knowledge and vision of things as they really are, for one deficient in the knowledge and vision of things as they really are, disenchantment and dispassion lack their proximate cause. When there is no disenchantment and dispassion, for one deficient in disenchantment and dispassion, the knowledge and vision of liberation lacks its proximate cause. Suppose there is a tree deficient in branches and foliage. Then its shoots do not grow to fullness. Also its bark, softwood, and heartwood do not grow to fullness. So too, when there is no mindfulness and clear comprehension, for one deficient in mindfulness and clear comprehension, the sense of moral shame and moral dread lack their proximate cause, all the way to the knowledge and vision of liberation lacks its proximate cause. Bhikkhus, when there is mindfulness and clear comprehension, for one possessing mindfulness and clear comprehension, the sense of moral shame and moral dread possess their proximate cause. When there is a sense of moral shame and moral dread, for one possessing a sense of moral shame and moral dread, restraint of the sense faculties possesses its proximate cause. When there is restraint of the sense faculties, for one who exercises restraint over the sense faculties, virtuous behavior possesses its proximate cause. When there is virtuous behavior, for one whose behavior is virtuous, right concentration possesses its proximate cause. When there is right concentration, for one possessing right concentration, the knowledge and vision of things as they really are possesses its proximate cause. When there is the knowledge and vision of things as they really are, for one possessing the knowledge and vision of things as they really are, disenchantment and dispassion possess their proximate cause. When there is disenchantment and dispassion, for one possessing disenchantment and dispassion, the knowledge and vision of liberation possesses its proximate cause. Suppose there is a tree possessing branches and foliage, then its shoots grow to fullness, also its bark, softwood, and heartwood grow to fullness. So too, when there is mindfulness and clear comprehension, for one possessing mindfulness and clear comprehension, the sense of moral shame and moral dread possess their proximate cause. When there is a sense of moral shame and moral dread, and repeating the previous sequence, the knowledge and vision of liberation possesses its proximate cause. Yes, I truly appreciate these sort of suttas that show how all these different Dhamma qualities are interconnected and how they build on each other, starting with mindfulness and hiriyottapa, and then they sort of build on each other one by one, leading to the final goal. So any comments or questions about anything?
Maybe just one of my latest preference for the translation of hiriyottapa, which is hiriyottapa is such a beautiful quality, and moral shame and moral dread. It weighs the heart out, but it's Bhikkhu Sujata, conscience and prudence. Prudence is a word that has been out of fashion for about 50 or 100 years. Unless you come from mind and
Did you know what I was thinking? Dear prudence.
Dear prudence. Everybody else is blank.
Now I'll be lost in the White Album for the rest of the day.
Does prudence have that sense of meaning of like, because I kind of think about it as like carefulness, or kind of also like a little bit of a wisdom. Like,
Yes.
this is wise.
Yes. Care, caution, attention to detail. So that sense of ottappa is that shrinking back from unskillful action.
Does ottappa have also a connotation of like thinking about other people's perceptions?
Yes, absolutely.
More so than hiri?
Yes, more so than hiri. And in fact, they tend to be a complement to each other. In that hiri, its basis is respect for oneself, so one protects oneself from their own good qualities. And ottappa is based on respect for others, so one's conscious of how one's actions affect others.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of time ottappa is often translated as like concern for wrongdoing. I mean, the wrongdoing that would affect somebody else, and yeah, the feeling is that sense of, oh my God, what, that sense of healthy shame. But
What have I done?
All right, well, I think that's enough for today.